Hello, everybody, and welcome to Crime Scenes with Coffee Beans, True Aussie Murders Caffeinated. I am your host, Belinda Brady, and welcome to episode 4. Episode 4 of Crime Scenes with Coffee Beans. Wowzers. And today I am drinking, as usual, coffee, and I'm drinking black coffee with peanut butter flavoured syrup. And I actually am really liking the peanut butter flavoured syrup. And yes, I do try all different kinds of syrups. I'm that kind of gal, but I am really liking this one. And just a little word of warning, this podcast today does cover murder, and it is a bit upsetting. So if you don't like murder, and I might swear, if you don't like murder, if you don't like swear words, I'm not your girl. This is not the podcast for you. But if it is, then settle in, get your drink, and get ready for me to tell you a tale, because I have a tale for you. Now, today I'm taking us to September 1934 in the town of Albury, New South Wales, Australia, where the body of a woman clad in Oriental-style pyjamas is found in a culvert, who remain unidentified for a whopping 10 years before she was identified, as well as her killer. Now, as a possible Australian first to help ID this woman, her deceased body, as it was found under that culvert, was put on display to help identify her. No, really, she was put on public display so people could walk past her and see if they recognised her. That's how desperate they were to ID this woman. So if this has grabbed you, kick back, relax, get your drink of choice, and join me as we discuss the Pyjama Girl murder, the infamous Pyjama Girl murder, on episode 4 of Crime Scenes and Coffee Beans, True Aussie Murders Caffeinated. Now, before we start, I need to list my sources for today for this episode. My sources are abd.anu.edu.au, biography /Agostini Linda, findagrave.com, Wikipedia, and trove.nla.gov.au /newspaper/article. Okay, so today's tale of murder takes place in a town called Albury, a town located on the New South Wales-Victoria border. Now, Albury is a major city of New South Wales today with a population of approximately 54,000 people. But back in 1934, where our murder takes place, the population was a relatively small one, with only approximately 10,000 people calling Albury their home. Tom Griffith was one who called Albury their home, and on the 1st of September 1939, he was leading his prized bull along Howlong Road when he noticed the strong smell of kerosene. Upon further inspection, he found the source of the kerosene hidden away in a culvert, and that was a body of a badly burned young woman, slightly concealed by a hessian bag, who had been set alight. Her head was wrapped in a towel, and her charred body was wearing silk pyjamas with a dragon motif. Now, in a post-Depression Australia, where things were brutally tough, people were struggling to put food on the table, clothing like this, even the humble pyjama, was seen as luxurious, especially silk ones, was seen as luxurious and something only the rich or exceptionally well-off could afford. Now, an x-ray of the body, when police came and took her body away, an x-ray discovered that she had been shot in the neck. Now, police were unable to work out who this poor girl was, so as an act to identify her, her body was preserved in formalin, and I hope I've said that right, in formalin in a zinc-lined bath, and put on display at the University of Sydney, in Sydney, New South Wales, in the hopes someone could identify her. Now, naturally, the body of a murdered woman drew quite the crowd of gawkers, and hell, I'd go and see it. Don't know about you guys, but I would definitely go and see it. And yes, her killer was one of the gawkers, but more on that later. and eventually she was identified, but only after a few misdirections. Several people had correctly ID'd her and had told the police, hey, this is so-and-so. But the dental records matching the name of the supposed victim didn't match the dental records of the body on display. So there was no positive match. So any claims on who the dead woman was not confirmed and was not taken seriously by police. That is until a whopping 10 years later, when the case was looked at again, forensic evidence was rehashed and new dental charts were made, and they, along with freckles on an upper arm, were all used to help positively identify Pyjama Girl. Pyjama Girl finally, 10 years later, had a name. And that name was Linda Agostini, a 28-year-old hairdresser and party girl. Now, in a twist of fate, an ironic twist of fate, her husband Tony, a waiter at the hugely popular Italian restaurant Romano's, had been questioned when his popular wife had abruptly disappeared, with Tony claiming she had simply up and left him. Now, in 1936, Tony moved to Perth in Western Australia, which is a state on the western side of Australia, and then he moved back to Sydney, New South Wales in 1938. He was detained at internments in Hay and Orange, and they are both towns in country New South Wales, from 1940 to 1944 due to his nationalist sympathies, but was eventually released, where he returned to his work at the restaurant Romano's. Now, Tony was interviewed again after Linda was positively ID'd, when they had rehashed the evidence, when they had those fresh dental records, and he was questioned again by Police Commissioner William John Mackay, who had known Tony since the 1930s, mainly through frequenting the Romano's restaurant, and Tony reluctantly and finally admitted his involvement with his wife Linda's death, and he was charged and committed to stand trial for the murder of his wife Linda, aka Pyjama Girl. Now, Tony stated that he and Linda had a very volatile marriage, with Linda having loved to drink and leaving Tony for long periods of time for God knows what. There was also physical altercations, where often with Linda the aggressor, and this is apparently how Linda died. Tony told police that they had had a fight in bed and it became physical, and Linda had pulled out a gun, but somehow ended up fatally shooting herself in the neck and passing away. Now, scared of being blamed for her death by the police, which is exactly what ended up happening anyway, Tony drove her body to Howlong Road, Albury, dumped her in a culvert and set her on fire, as you do. But as always, we need to find out how Linda and Tony got here, how they got to be in a place where he is dumping her body and setting her alight in a culvert in her pajamas, and how he talked his way into what would say is an unfair charge, and the end result for Tony. So as always, we need to go back to the beginning. There's always a beginning, always. So put me on pause if you need to, grab another drink, grab another coffee, settle in, and let's get into the nitty-gritty of the love and loss of Tony and Linda Agostini, aka Pyjama Girl. Okay, welcome back for those guys who have put me on pause. All right, let's go to the beginning. And the beginning we are diving into right now. Now, Antonio, or Tony as he was known, and I will refer to him as Tony in this episode, and I have referred to him as Tony. Antonio Agostini was born on the 20th of May 1903 in Treviso, Italy, and he migrated to Australia in 1927, where he leased the cloakroom in the affluent Italian restaurant Romano's. Now, Romano's was the place to be seen back in the day and was known for, lots of things, but just to name a few things, it was known for its extensive menu, It had 370 dishes on its menu, each one of them said to be exquisite. The place had an orchestra that played as the diners ate and sipped their wine. The place had 138 wall mirrors and a bust of Napoleon on display. But it was the mix of diners that really helped this restaurant flourish and become as popular as it was. It attracted the affluent side of society, the ones who wore fancy evening dresses and glamour to dinner, and celebrities and important people, and at times it had royalty. Prince Philip had dined there, but it was also within reach for the less well off, the more average people. They were most welcome. No one was turned away. And that was the real charm of the place. It had something for everybody. Rich, poor, in between, everyone was welcome and everyone absolutely adored the place. It was really a special occasion to dine there, and it was one of only two fashionable nightclubs in the Sydney area at the time. Oh, and it also sold unlicensed liquor during World War II and the years that followed, which I thought was a really cool point to add. Now, Tony was 5 foot, which is approximately 170 centimetres, tall, slim, with dark hair. He was a good-looking guy and very popular. And by all reports, he loved his life in Australia, but he was also immensely proud of his Italian heritage, and he was a very visible and active member of the Italian community. I couldn't find any incidents or dirt on him. He was pretty clean up until Linda's murder. And that brings us to Linda. Now, Linda Agostini was born Linda Platt, and she was born on the 12th of September 1905 in Forest Hill, London. Now, Linda migrated to New Zealand in 1926 and crossed the ditch from New Zealand to Australia the following year. Now, Linda was small, like tiny. She was only 5 feet, which is about 153 centimetres. But she was attractive, outgoing, and well-liked. She was really popular. But she had her demons, and drink was one of them. Now, Linda apparently was a heavy drinker and a party goer, having come of age in the roaring jazz era that took the world by storm during the 1920s and the 1930s. And apparently she had trouble adapting to any kind of stability. In between partying, Linda worked as a cinema usherette, and somewhere along the way she crossed paths with Tony, and the couple eventually married at a registry office in Sydney on the 22nd of April 1930. But the newlyweds' honeymoon period was short-lived, with Linda leaving Tony for days on end to drink and party, which Tony hated, and he also hated the fact that it brought shame on him in the Italian community. It was very frowned upon. Now, desperate to get her away from her bad influences of drink and parties and her friends, the couple decided to move to Carlton, which is a suburb in the state of Victoria. And Tony took up a job in a newspaper, and Linda got employment as a hairdresser in a salon called Ferrari's. But the marriage was still an unhappy one, full of fighting and the occasional violence. So when Linda suddenly disappeared from her friends' and family's lives, eyebrows were raised, as Linda never just really dropped off the radar, and questions were asked of Tony, and Tony simply stated that she had left him, with no evidence that anything else other than that had happened. And I guess with Linda's past behaviour of having left Tony for days, I would assume it would be easy for her friends and family to think, okay, maybe she has left him for good this time. Now, interestingly enough, when the dead girl was found, Linda's name had been put forward as a possible victim due to the uncanny resemblance to her. Now, remember, she was on public display for years, but the police dismissed those possibilities, and besides, the dental records didn't match Linda's at the time. But of course, some 10 years later, in 1944, forensic evidence was examined, a dental analysis was found to match Linda, and this time it was a positive match to Linda Agostini. So They've rehashed evidence. They've got new dental records. They've matched them to Linda's dental records that were known to be hers when she was alive. We have a match 10 years later. Now, with this new information at hand, Police Commissioner William Mackay, who knew Tony when he worked in Romano's, paid his old friend a visit. Now, a nervous Tony, after a bit of questioning, then went on to confess to the murder of his wife, but it wasn't as sinister as he thinks, or as we would think it would be, according to Tony. And he confessed to having been involved in his wife's death, but it was accidental. Now, as I've said earlier, Tony and Linda's marriage was volatile and at times violent. And the morning Linda had died, Tony stated that she had a gun in her hand and had accidentally shot herself in the neck with it. Now, terrified of being charged with murder and going to jail, Tony did what most of us would do, and sarcasm alert if you can't detect it in my voice, drive our dead wife's body across town, dump her in a culvert and set her on fire. I mean, hey, who wouldn't do that? Anyway, Tony was arrested on the 6th of March and taken to Melbourne, which is the capital of the state of Victoria, and charged with the murder of his wife, Linda. The trial was to take place in April 1944, 10 years after Linda had died. Now, the trial took place, and according to a newspaper covering the trial, Tony stated that he had gone through absolute hell keeping his secret for 10 years and was glad to have finally confessed, was glad to have finally gotten it off his chest. He also claimed that he had told a friend in the Italian community what had happened to his wife years earlier, but his friend advised Tony against telling the police and just told Tony to get on with his life and forget about it. Now, Tony stated Linda was a heavy drinker and he used to find empty whiskey bottles around the house. Apparently, she was prone to outbursts of rage, angry outbursts, accusing Tony of doing things to make her jealous and then storming out of the house and going on a drinking binge, justifying her actions because of the jealousy that Tony made her feel. She made Tony's friends feel uncomfortable and unwelcome in their home. She accused Tony of having affairs. On many occasions, she threatened his life, and on one occasion in particular, she apparently mouthed the words, "I will kill you someday." According to Tony, his wife was hot and cold, Jekyll and Hyde, full of rage one minute, remorse the next, desperate to change things and to meet Linda's desire to also change things, because when she wasn't full of a red hot rage for Tony, she was full of remorse and desire to make things right and to change her behaviour. So, desperate to change things, the couple agreed to move to Melbourne. But alas, any change was only for a short while, and Linda very quickly fell back into her old habits and apparently was just as bad as she was in Sydney, partying, drinking, angry outbursts. She told Tony she would leave him. She was making him miserable. "Oh, I'm making you miserable, I will leave you." She would then lash out and go on another bender, abusive towards him, yelling at him, raging at him, being violent with him. And it was a never-ending, vicious cycle of rage and hate and tears and alcohol and booze and hate and love and hate, until it all came to a violent head on or around the 27th of August, 1934. Now, according to Tony, he awoke to his alarm after a restless sleep thanks to another night of Linda's drunken rantings, to the feeling of something pressed against his left ear. Now, he quickly realised it was a gun, and he quickly turned his head, grabbing the gun and Linda's hand that was holding the gun in the process. The couple struggled, and Tony said he was surprised by Linda's strength and determination to keep the gun in her hand and hurt him. Now, somewhere in the struggle, Tony got scratched in the head. Now, that's an important point to remember for a little bit later. But they were fighting over the gun. They were rolling over in the bed, still struggling, when all of a sudden, according to Tony, the gun went off. Linda gave a long gasp and she stopped struggling. She was dead, accidentally shot in the struggle to disarm her. Tony was shocked. He was devastated. He was a wreck. He was heartbroken. He was absolutely devastated. He then told of how he had planned to call the police that morning, but in a state of shock, he went up and got up and went about his day as usual. He dressed, he ate, he went to work. In denial, classic case of denial. Now, the longer he delayed calling the police, the more attractive covering up Linda's death became. Now, he was worried about his family, his friends, his job, and his reputation in the Italian community, something that he held very dear. So he decided to dump her body and set her alight. And he did that. He left their home early on the morning of the 1st of September, so a few days after Linda was killed. Linda's pyjama-clad body in the car and drove to the culvert in Albury, wrapped her up in a hessian bag, put her in the culvert and set her alight. He then drove to his friend's place. Now, his friend was known as Mr. Castellane, and I hope I have pronounced that right, and popped in, saw his friend. Now, his friend noticed the scratch on his head, which he had gotten when he was fighting with Linda over the gun. When his friend asked how he got the scratch on his head, Tony lied and just said, I did it at work or gardening or in the house. But when his friend noticed how sick and how stressed out Tony looked, he took notice and, worried, he paid his friend a visit a few days later to check on him, and eventually Tony confessed everything. Now, his friend, Mr. Castellan, convinced Tony to keep quiet. Don't tell the police, don't confess, don't do anything. It's done, you can't undo it. Just get on with life and forget about it. Now, remarkably, not long after Linda's body was discovered, a police officer stopped by and paid Tony a visit. He showed Tony a photo of Linda's body and asked if he recognised her. Now, Tony said he was that nervous, he was sure the cop would have picked up on how nervous he was and gotten a bit suspicious. But apparently the police officer didn't. Tony denied knowing who that woman was, who the deceased person was, and the officer went on his way. And Tony went on with life. Between 1936 and 1937, Tony made a trip to Sydney. So remember, he moved over to Perth in Western Australia. He made a trip back to Sydney and was approached by Linda's friends asking, "Where's Linda? Where on earth is she?" He told them that she had gone away, just gone away, which I guess, isn't entirely untrue. He was also approached by another cop, another police officer, wanting him to come and see if he recognised the body on display at the university, if he thought that was his wife. So off they went to the university together to view Linda's body on display. And of course, Tony said he did not recognise the body to be that of his supposedly missing wife, Linda. Now, it seems that the jury believed Tony's story and they found him guilty, but not of murder, of the lesser charge of manslaughter. And he was sentenced to 6 years in jail with hard labour. Now, when he was released, he was deported to Italy, back to Italy under general amnesty, and Tony married a widow and eventually passed away in 1969. Now, I couldn't seem to find any information about if he went on to have any children or not. Meanwhile, Linda was finally buried on the 13th of July, 1944, some 10 years after she had died. She was given a state funeral and she now rests in Preston Cemetery. Now, of course, as there always is with, high interests and infamous murders, there are some theories around that the Pyjama Girl wasn't Linda and it was somebody else. So, you can do a deep dive into theories about that, but I'm not going to do that. I mean, for me, I think if you have a dental ID, if you have dental records that match, you have a confession by a husband that, yes, I was there when she died, I disposed of her body. I mean, what more do you need? I think probably the question here is, did he murder her, or was it really a wife who tried to kill him and then somehow ended up killing herself? I mean, he does paint a pretty horrid picture of Linda. So, but I mean, of course, she's dead. She can't defend herself and she can't tell her side of the story. So we are taking his word for it. But I mean, I guess for me, I think it probably is a case of he did wake up and there was a gun to his head and there was a struggle, and unfortunately Linda ended up shooting herself. I tend to believe that, and when you look at his testimony and the state of their marriage, it's not that hard to believe. But I mean, flip side to it could have been he'd had enough and killed her. So what do you guys think? Do you think it was an accident? Do you think it was just an accident where, Linda had tried to kill him and unfortunately it misfired and got her? Or do you think it was deliberate murder by a husband who was fed up with his partying wife and her abusive alcoholic ways? Or do you think it's not her at all and Linda did just literally pack up and leave? I'd love to know what you think about this, but that's it. Episode 4, done and dusted. Pyjama Girl, crime scenes with coffee beans. We are done. And so thank you so much for your company, and I hope you've enjoyed the podcast, and I have really enjoyed talking about this case. It's just fascinating. So I hope you have enjoyed it, and if you have any feedback, if you have any questions, of course I love hearing from people. I would love to hear from you guys. Feel free to reach out. I'm here to talk and take any feedback, anything on board. And until next episode, guys, thank you so much for listening. You're all rock stars. And stay safe, stay cool, and stay caffeinated.